Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another Energon universe discussion video. The subject of today's video is Duke number 1, the newest entry in Skybound's Energon universe lineup, starring Conrad S. Hauser, aka Duke, obviously. The issue's release on December 27th, 2023 marks the official beginning of the latest G.I. Joe comics continuity, one that from the very beginning will be part of a shared universe with Transformers and Skybound's original series, Void Rivals. I have to admit right up front here, I'm not as deep into G.I. Joe as I am Transformers. I'm a fan, but I wouldn't say I'm a hardcore fan. Most of my familiarity with the franchise lore comes from the Marvel comics, the IDW comics, some of the original cartoon, and of course, the toys. And even then, I wouldn't say that my familiarity with those aspects of the franchise is super in-depth, certainly not to the same degree as Transformers. But even from that somewhat limited perspective, I have to say that this issue was a great read. You don't really need to have any familiarity with G.I. Joe at all to pick this up and enjoy it, though I think you will get a little more out of it if you have even some minor knowledge of the characters in the world. For me, what makes G.I. Joe fiction so fun and enjoyable is the military thriller component with layers of deceit, setups, double crosses, and conspiracies. And that's the pocket Duke number 1 is operating in, but it's doing so in a way that I honestly didn't expect. This issue begins in the aftermath of Duke's brief cameo in Transformers number 2, which saw him narrowly escape death at the hands of Starscream. We saw most of the pages from this opening section when Skybound released previews for the issue, and from them I assumed that Hawk was going to be bringing Duke into a new unit focused on dealing with the newly arrived Cybertronian threat, ultimately establishing G.I. Joe, but that isn't what happens. Instead, frustrated with his superiors for apparently covering up or perhaps turning a blind eye to the existence of Cybertronians, Duke goes looking for answers on his own, and by issue's end is branded a rogue operative, with Stalker and Rock and Roll being called on to bring him in for issue number 2. Seeing Duke go all Infinity War Cap in abandoning both his government as well as his clean-cut personal grooming habits was a bit of a surprise and took a little getting used to, but by the end of the issue I was fully on board. Considering he's rocking this look on all of the as of now solicited covers following issue number 1, I think it's safe to say it's going to stick around for a while. I'd be curious to see if we'd ever get a figure of this version of the character in Hasbro's classified line. There's already some brand synergy happening in one direction with Stalker, Rock and Roll, and Zorana seemingly taking some influences from their classified figures, so I wouldn't mind seeing that go the other way, with some of the comic designs finding their way into the toys. This one especially, since Classified has been doing an awesome job with their bearded head sculpts. The recently released Snow Job is the best one they've done yet, and is maybe my favorite head sculpt from the entire line, so yeah, I definitely wouldn't mind seeing this version of Duke in classified form. But I digress. I've always seen similarities between G.I. Joe and the Metal Gear Solid series, since they're both military thrillers with a bunch of wild science fiction and mystical stuff baked in, and served with a side of ninja. And while this first issue of Duke doesn't go full-bore neon insanity, there's still some room for comparisons to be made to the Konami franchise, specifically with Duke's solo infiltration of M.A.R.S. Industries, which features a segment that reminds me of Snake infiltrating Groznygrad in MGS3, where there's this viewing window overlooking a massive hangar housing the Shagohod. Maybe it's just me, but I think that's very similar to what happens in Duke number 1. Here, however, there's a ton of G.I. Joe visual references on the other side of the screen, including Hiss tanks, fangs, snake armor, and I'm not sure about the tanks. Cats, maybe? And this thing looks like a claw, but it seems a little big, so I don't know. But also bats, which I was very excited and happy to see. Hopefully they'll find their way into the main story soon, as I think they're just really cool. But anyway, yeah, maybe there are some things that remind me of Metal Gear Solid here, but what this issue really reminds me of is the 1996 Mission Impossible movie. The beats aren't organized the same way, but the setup for Duke number 1 is one exploding fish tank escape away from being Mission Impossible with G.I. Joe characters. Although at the end, after Duke is framed, he does jump out of a window. For those of you who somehow haven't seen this movie, the premise of Mission Impossible is that Golden Boy operative Ethan Hunt is framed as a mole in his unit, goes on the run to clear his name and find the real mole. Sound familiar? Sure, the details don't line up perfectly, but the general shape seems similar to me. Don't get me wrong, Duke has its own identity. The book is definitely not just a ripoff of Mission Impossible, but was maybe inspired by it to some degree in a way that works in its favor, in my opinion. The rogue super soldier operative on the run to uncover a conspiracy thing translates really well to G.I. Joe, and it's a premise that I like. If nothing else, the comparison could actually shed some light on some things that we know about future issues. For example, in the movie, Ethan forges alliances with disavowed off-the-grid agents and shady arms dealers to accomplish his goals. So, putting Duke in a similar setup might explain how Baroness winds up on the same side as Duke and or G.I. Joe. Duke may simply have nowhere else to turn, assuming, that is, that the whole thing with Baroness isn't just the next step in a plan hatched by M.A.R.S. and or Cobra. After all, it seems likely that one of the two organizations attempted to frame Duke at the end of the issue. Your vests say police, but your helmets scream Cobra! Or maybe a proto-Cobra organization, if you will. It's unclear if either G.I. Joe or Cobra exists yet in this timeline, but if not, the foundations for both are in place. Whether it's called G.I. Joe or not, we're starting to learn more about Hawk's unit, with some additional faces that weren't included in the roster tease that Skybound released over social media last year. I've already mentioned Rock and Roll, but Courtney Krieger, aka CoverGirl, the figure included with the Wolverine vehicle from 1983, also makes a brief first appearance in this continuity. But the coolest first appearance has got to go to Destro. He's admittedly not in it much, but this page is a fitting reveal for the Laird of Castle Destro. I love this page, with the flames around this kind of platform or whatever it is with the throne at the center, the castle relics on one side with the Iron Maiden and what I'm assuming is a taxidermied leopard, which that's gotta be a nod to the Pimp Daddy Destro figure, right? Or maybe I should say Prophet Director Destro? Anyway, the whole thing is tied off nicely with the high-tech consoles and red lights on the other side. This whole composition just does justice to the character, living on the bleeding edge of technology while keeping one foot firmly in the past and the traditions of his family lineage. Aside from a brief Mindbender Easter egg, I'd say the biggest nod to the past of the G.I. Joe franchise in this issue is Dr. Adele Burkhart, a character introduced in the first issue of the Marvel Comics story, Operation Lady Doomsday. Given her history with the beginning of the comic fiction, it's fitting that Dr. Burkhart appears in a reimagined capacity at the beginning of this continuity, and although her appearance is brief, her presence is significant, arguably setting the storyline involving Mars Industries in motion, and plot components introduced by this character will likely play into events in future issues. Additionally, we get a tease for the introduction of another character via Dr. Burkhart. The attack on her office, the act Duke is framed for, is said to have been carried out by a man who flew in from Australia, which I take to mean that he himself is Australian. And sure, there are other characters from the land down under, like some of the Dreadnoks, but I'm wondering if this isn't setting up a major antagonist in the form of Major Blood. We'll just have to wait and see on that, but in terms of the art, there's a number of things to like in this first issue, and overall I'd say it's a great fit for the story being told here, but the highlight of the issue for me was Duke's fight with Mercer. This sequence features some really nicely executed hand-to-hand combat, with the participants blocking and dodging in a way that allows the reader to clearly visualize the movement and choreography happening between the panels. The attention given to this segment is appropriate and even necessary for the genre this book is going for, and Tom Reilly's skillful depiction of this fight makes me very optimistic indeed for the action and combat scenes in this series moving forward. I'm also a big fan of how Jordie Bellaire colored this panel, where color consistency fantasy and realism is dispensed with to emphasize the visceral action, with Mercer in black and white, and Duke colored in a spattering of color that bleeds unevenly across his figure, all set against a red background with white motion lines. It's pretty striking, enough so that Bellaire used it more than once in this issue, but it really helps to underscore how each of the titles in the Energon universe have bold and distinct visual identities. I think that's cleverly acknowledged in regards to lettering in this very issue. When Duke is reliving the issues of Transformers #2, the sound effect lettering is done in an homage to how it appeared in that issue of Transformers, and it's mirrored in Duke's visor, whereas the rest of the sound effects in Duke #1 are done in a different style, but one that is still cohesive and consistent with the visual identity of this book. Of the Energon universe titles slated for release, Duke was the one I was least excited for, but I have to say that this series exceeded my expectations. The only complaint that I have, and it's so minor that it's bordering on asinine, is that there's a Grawlix during the fight with Mercer, a Grawlix being a substitution of symbols for the letters of a swear word. And while I acknowledge that they're part of the history and language of comics, I hate the usage of Grawlixes in modern comics. Well, depending on the tone. I think they're best used in comedic works and feel very out of place outside of that genre. My preference is for writers to either write around swearing if they're not allowed to do it, or for a little leeway to be given and allow for some minor swearing on rare occasions. I mean, a Spike could get away with it in the 1986 Transformers movie aimed at kids. It should be fine here, but what do I know? That being said, I can see why Williamson would take the hit here, as it's a good line. Would have been better without the Grawlix, but you get my point. Other than that very minor complaint, I don't have any other problems with this issue. I'd be curious to see how the book lands for hardcore G.I. Joe fans, but regardless, even if you're not into G.I. Joe, I think if you like spy or military thrillers or action, then this is an easy recommendation. Plus, it's part of the Energon universe, so it has that going for it as well. It's part of a bigger picture, after all. It's obviously too soon to say how Skybound's Joe comics will measure up to my preferred runs by Hama, Dixon, and Costa, but it's off to a really strong start, and I'm looking forward to more. But that's it from me, so I'll turn it over to you. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Are you a G.I. Joe fan? Or is this your introduction to the franchise? Whatever the case, thank you for watching the video. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.